Good morning everyone, this week's Forensics Friday is all about these things, your fingerprints. So I'll be telling you more about those shortly in just a few seconds. So firstly, what are fingerprints? So fingerprints are the patterns that you have on your fingers and on your toes, and they're made by friction ridges, which are the raised parts you have on your fingers, and also the furrows, which are the lower parts of your fingers. So if you look at your fingers, you might need to look a bit closely. You'll be able to see there's loads of parallel lines on your fingers, and you can look at your toes too if you wish. So this is your friction ridge detail. So there are three types of fingerprints. There's visible and those which can be seen by your eyes without any kind of enhancement. There are impressions, which is something that's left in something that can be moulded, so it takes the shape of your fingerprint. And there's also lace prints, and these are fingerprints which need to be enhanced first before they can be seen with your eyes. So, how are fingerprints formed? So your fingerprints start forming when you're a very little tiny embryo. On your fingers and on your feet and on the palms of your hand you have these things called volar pads, and when you're an embryo forming, basically they kind of look a bit like sucker pads, or say if you imagine like an octopus's tentacle, the suckers that you have on there, that's what kind of it looks like to me anyway. So you have the volar pads on the ends of your fingers and the ends of your toes, and about at 10/11 weeks your volar pads stop growing but your hand continues to grow. So as your hand continues to grow, your volar pads end up shrinking back into your hand, and the skin on the volar pads creates these nice folds, and these are the start of your ridge detail. So firstly, that is the epidermal ridge detail, so the detail that's quite far down in your fingerprint. So when these ridges are formed, they are objected into the top layer of the dermis, so that it's covered to protect them and keep them all nice and secure really. As your hand continues to grow, your ridges also grow to keep up with your hand growing. So that's why you have quite a lot of ridge detail on your fingerprints and your toes. At about 14 weeks, your sweat glands start to appear along the ridges, and at 15 weeks, secondary ridges start to form, and these are the ones that don't have sweat glands on them. At 17 to 24 weeks, the second level of ridges, they start to grow and increase, and they grow until they reach the same abundancy as the primary ridges. And at 24 weeks, your fingerprints are basically fully formed, and you can compare these to those of an adult. That's how much detail is in them. So if you look at this image just here, you'll be able to see how it starts off with no volar pad, and then you'll get your volar pad growing. And then as you can see, it will start to trickle off and your volar pad shrunk back into your hands. So your volar pad is essentially important in determining what kind of pattern you have at the core of your fingerprint. So if you look here, you can see if the pad is quite large and high, you're more likely to have what is known as a whorl. If it's more to one side of your finger rather than in the centre, you're more likely to have a loop. And if it's quite a low pad, so it's not too high, you're more likely to have an arch. So why are fingerprints important? Fingerprints are a biometric, which essentially means that they're a physical characteristic which is unique to you and to me and to everyone else in the world, and this can be used to identify you, or me, or them. There's no two people in the world that have the exact same fingerprints. Even though identical twins, they don't have the exact same fingerprints. So though your fingerprints may look the same, it's like for mine for example, I have 9 loops and 1 whorl as my fingerprints. So if I just quickly look at my loops, they all look relatively the same, so I suppose to some people you might think that they're exactly the same. But when you have a closer look at all the lines and all the ridge details, you'll be able to see that they're in fact completely different, so no two fingerprints are the same. So there are 3 different levels that are looked at when looking at fingerprints. There's the first level detail, and that is basically what pattern you have at the core of your fingerprint. So these, as I said, were determined by your volar pads. So you can either have an arch, so that's lines that start at one side of your finger. They come across, tend slightly, so they come up a little bit to make it almost like a triangle shape, but without the pointy edges, and then come back down and leave on the other side of your fingerprint. You can have a loop, which again starts at one side of your finger, comes round to about the middle-ish, loops round, and then leaves the same side they entered. And you have a whorl, which is a whorl pattern that's surrounded by circular ridges in the middle of your fingerprint. Next we have second level detail, and second level detail is what's normally used to make a comparison between two fingerprints to see whether they match or whether they don't match. So if you look here, you'll be able to see that some of the ridge endings and some of the ridges are labelled. So firstly we have the core, which, as we mentioned, that is where you have your pattern at the centre of your fingerprint. We also have things such as ridge endings, that's obviously the end of a ridge, that's one's pretty straightforward. We have a short ridge, which is a ridge that's quite short in length compared to all the rest of the ridges. We have items such as the spur, and that's a tiny bit of ridge that comes off a ridge line, so it's not enough to be classed as a bifurcation, which we'll talk about in just one moment, but so it's only a little tiny bit by itself. We have things called a crossover, so that's when two ridges on different, say, levels almost, meet together by another ridge end combining them. So we have a bifurcation, which is one ridge end that then forks into two, and then we have things that are either called like ridge enclosure, island or lake, and this is essentially a ridge that splits into two but then joins again to equal one ridge at the end. So there's like a big circle in the middle, so that's either your lake, your island or your ridge enclosure. And finally we have the delta. The delta is quite similar to the bifurcation in the fact that it's one ridge end that then forks into two. However, a delta is normally quite an obtuse shape, whereas the bifurcation is definitely an acute angle at which it breaks, and your delta is important in helping you identify a fingerprint essentially. So remember how we talked about the different kind of patterns you get at the core of your fingerprint? So for example, an arch doesn't have any deltas in the fingerprint. A loop has only one delta, and that is located the other side of the fingerprint. So say for example, if I had a loop on this finger, which is to the left, so it enters from the left, it comes up, circles round and comes back out at the left, the delta can be found at the right. And with a whirl, there are two deltas present, one at either side. So then we have third level detail. Third level detail is observed under a microscope, and this is to show you the sweat pores. So if you look at this image just here, you'll be able to see that the grey lines are your ridge detail. So they've either been done by inking or dusting. I think probably dusting in this case because of the colour of them. But can you notice the little white circles? They are your sweat pores or your sweat glands. So they are, again, like your fingerprints, they are unique to you. So these can also be used to identify you. You'll see them of your own fingerprint under the microscope also, like this picture. So how are fingerprints analysed? So fingerprints are passed through a database, which then scans the database for any fingerprints which look like it may be a match. Once it's found a few of these, there might be just a couple or there might be hundreds. These are then passed on to a fingerprint expert who will manually compare the crime scene print and also the prints from the database. And the fingerprint expert will do this using something called ACE-V. So ACE-V is analysis, comparison, evaluation and verification. So firstly, it starts with analysis. So firstly, the fingerprint expert will look at the crime scene print and identify the first, second and possibly third level detail of that fingerprint. Then they'll move on to the comparison aspect, and that's when they'll compare the crime scene print to the reference print. And in the evaluation, they'll decide pretty much whether they are a match or whether they don't match. And under the verification process, their decision that they've made and the two prints will be checked by at least two other fingerprint experts to make sure that their decision that they've come to is correct. So here you can see we've got two prints that have been compared together. So you have one which is a crime scene print, and you can see that that's a bit blurry to your eyes to see. And you can see the other one which is a reference print, and that one is more clear to see. So as you can see, there are 16 points that have been labelled which are sites of comparison that have matched. So before in a course of law you used to have to provide at least 16 points which match for you to confirm that is a correct identification of a match. However, that practice is no longer used. So as you can see here, there's 16 points that are matched, and that would basically say that those two do match. And I can see there is way more than 16 points on there to make a match, so they can continue and do pretty much all the fingerprints if they need it. In a fingerprint such as this, you would start at an area which is quite unique. So you'd start maybe at the core, or possibly at the delta, or if there's quite a few bifurcations in one area, or say for example if there's a lake, you would start in an area that is quite unique, and you'd find the point on one print, and then you would look at the other print to see around that same area whether it had the same characteristic. And you do this by counting the ridge lines and working either your way in or your way out. However, you don't always get a full fingerprint to make a comparison. Like this image just here, you might only get part of a print, or the print from the crime scene is distorted with only part of the ridge detail being shown. So therefore you have to kind of use your own initiative really, and do as best as you can to look for identifying and unique characteristics. So as you can see in this print here, I have marked 5 little spots where there is a comparison, and they're located in yellow. So obviously the darker image is the crime scene print, and the one that's more grey and clearer to see is the reference print. And you can see the pore sweat, and you can see the sweat pores and glands in the reference print, but I think it's pretty cool. Majority of the points of comparison in this print, in these two prints, are their bifurcations. So if we work from the top down, so the first one you can see is a bifurcation, and the second point is actually a bifurcation of that bifurcation. So you can see those two on both prints quite clearly. Then if we work our way down to the next one, that is a bifurcation, and again along that is another bifurcation, and from that is another bifurcation. But as you can see, without knowing what exact details to look for, it's quite hard to make a comparison, and it could easily be missed.